Namaste. Welcome to the Apes Hammer Show. This is weekly English talk show on Indigenous television and ITV Nepal. This talk show features a guest from different walk of life, and we discuss on issues impacting Indigenous peoples worldwide, and we try to connect the issues and also share the experiences and lesson learned. In this talk show, we sometimes feature online interviews, sometimes face-to-face interviews, and especially invite the guests from different countries or work on different issues. Today, I have a very special guest. He comes from India. He is independent researcher, and in fact, he is a multi-talented person that he works in multi-field. Lately, he conducted a research related with the modern slavery and connecting with the climate change and so forth. So let me introduce him. Let me introduce you my guest today. His name is Ritwajit Das. He comes from India, but mostly works with INGOs covering the Asias, and a lot of hats he wears. So, Ritwajit, first of all, thank you for coming and thank you for joining. Let's welcome to the show.
Namaste, Dave. Thank you so much for inviting me for this talk. I'm really glad and delighted to be here. Thank you.
Ritz, in short, he's known as Ritz. So I actually met him when we were together in covering the COP issue.
Yeah.
Conference of parties related with climate change
Right.
that was held in Egypt.
Yeah.
In Al Sharm Sheikh, and
Yeah.
we spent about 2 weeks together.
Right.
So he is today in my studio. So as I told you, a brief introduction about you in background. So Ritz, could you introduce yourself and your involvement with some organizations, the issues that you are working with, to start with our conversation, please?
Thank you, Dave. I'm a South Asia and the Global South researcher on climate. And it's, when I say researcher, it's not a very unified terminology. It's multifaceted. So it has like targeted action research that could be used with activism and advocacy and all of that. So being a part of like whole value chain when you say about action research. So yes, in last 8 to 9 years, I'm into human rights and climate justice space. Looking at different areas around climate mobility, modern slavery, issues around marginalization and how climate change is disproportionately kind of like putting pressure points on indigenous communities and other marginalized communities in South Asia and Global South. I'm fortunate to work with INGOs like IDSN, Anti-Slavery, Amnesty, ARISA, EU-based, UNOHCHR, worked with some sort of special procedure submission and all of that. So yeah, my last project is with Anti-Slavery International and International Institute for Environment and Development. We specifically looked at how modern slavery is going to be exacerbated because of climate change and climate mobility.
Thank you, Ritz, for giving me this old background. And I also happen to read the research that you conducted and you really shared, and that actually goes in detail what that modern slavery all about, connecting with climate change. And many people actually talk about this modern slavery. The slavery is one of the oldest terms.
Okay.
People actually use it, but now you are connecting with climate change and modern slavery that you have termed. For a clarification, just could you just tell us to my viewers that what that modern slavery all about, and share a kind of experiences, case studies that you included, including from Nepal,
Right.
Cambodia, and other countries as well
Right.
from the South Asian countries.
Right.
Relating that case studies, could you just elaborate about that term, please?
Thank you, Dave. You rightly said that we know about like the colonial definition of slavery, and nothing much has changed since then. Marginalized and ostracized and disenfranchised communities are still facing slavery. And in contemporary times, we are calling it modern slavery, but issues are the same. The subjugation is the same, and the entrapment is the same. So modern slavery, like it's a definition which been championed by Anti-Slavery International. They are specifically looking at two or three major components. One is your forced labor, debt labor, where a particular community or group of people are locked into intergenerational slave-like situation where you have to kind of like pay the debt through your physical labor. Not only as a person, but your whole family is sort of like getting entrapped into those kind of condition. Then we look at like trafficking, human trafficking aspect. We are looking at child trafficking, women trafficking, sexual and also domestic servitude. So yeah, these are some of those key markers which been identified in contemporary terms, which is still prevalent in present times, and mainly we can see how it's been affecting a much larger marginalized population in global South countries, specifically South Asia and Southeast Asia and Sub-Saharan Africa. Now, coming up to a couple of the examples, we looked at how the whole economy of Nepal is involved in, like remittance. Remittance plays a very key economic, criteria for the country, and a lot of migrant worker go to different places, be it UAE, Qatar, Middle East, or Malaysia, or US maybe, or EU, and they are subjugated to harsh condition, right? They don't have an agency, and who are these people they go? Mostly they go because of economic stress, but also because of climate change. They are losing their house, their land. They are feeling pressured to kind of let go their home in search of something that just will ensure their survival. So we looked into specifically in Nepal. We worked with experts like Som Nirula from Nepal Institute of Peace, Rashtriya Dalit Network, how they have like conducted advocacy and awareness generation specifically to Dalit and other marginalized groups in Nepal when they are moving out of the country, what sort of rights, safety measures they need to be looking at, what are the drivers of this kind of movement. From Nepal, we collected issues around Kamaya community, and and from Pradesh, Harava Charawa, Harua Charua, yes. So yeah, like we looked into those communities specifically, and one of the partners, the Freedom Fund, which is based out of London, they are also pretty much active. They sort of like told us to where to look at, and that happened. In Cambodia, Cambodia is of late facing an economic development within the country. So a lot of like infrastructure building is happening, new residential projects, big corporate buildings are being built on in the capital and sub-metropolitan areas. As a result of that, the BRIC links is kind of like doing forced labor to the indigenous community of Cambodia. They are getting locked into very harsh working condition, and because of climate change, there are issues about heat waves and all, and also like these indigenous communities are losing their natural forest and their dependency on forest and their livelihood and food security. So they don't have any options just to kind of like come and work on this brick making factories and units, and thus they are just bodies for labor. That's all. Some of the examples from South Asia, the other examples we picked up from Sri Lanka, like in the tea garden workers, right? So they don't have. We specifically looked into Malaya Tamils. They being transferred during the colonial time by the British Empire, and still they don't have. Like a couple of months back, they didn't have the citizenship, right? They didn't have right to vote, and they're particularly locked into those tea garden areas. the only purpose they are serving is to kind of like, helping the Sri Lankan tea industry, and they've not been given any sort of like entitlements. They've not been given any sort of government backed services, be it pension, social protection, education, and all of that. So we looked into that as particular case. Similar, like bricklaying conditions we have observed in Pakistan as well, where Afghan refugees are being, and also minority, religious minority workers also seeing forced labor like condition in extreme heat wave like work environment.
Yeah. So you didn't look specifically on certain groups, but
Yes.
your issues were in general. So I'm really happy that you brought the issue of freed Kamayas.
Yeah.
My colleague Dashi Tharu, who is behind this camera,
Yeah.
his community actually Tharu. The issue. This is one of the one of the emerging issues that the Tharu indigenous community actually
Right.
were fighting against the government or against this landlord. They actually once used to be a landlord, but they were tricked.
Yeah.
And they are still, some of the household members, they are still facing a kind of bonded labor. So government lately has declared a kind of this freed Kamayas means freed bonded labor and so forth, but then their condition has not changed to. So there is a lot to do, to work in that area. But okay, I want to sift a little bit from your this modern slavery to climate change.
Yeah.
So when you talk about the climate change, you already said that some minority groups, especially indigenous peoples, who are at the forefront, and they are vulnerable communities, right? As you said, rightly
Yes.
said. So some scholars, not scholars, but indigenous peoples aspect is that obviously the climate change impacted whole world, all communities equally, but the indigenous peoples who are living in the forest or nearby the rivers are more vulnerable in that. So in your research or in your work areas, how do you relate the condition of indigenous peoples with the climate change? Since staying in India, you have traveled so many other South Asian countries. What is your observations with indigenous people, especially with climate change and that issues?
Well, I am in this space of climate change for more than 15 years, and I have some, kind of like strong informed opinion, how the space is being dominated by conversations around science, technology, policy, business, and governance. But climate change it's still been, and it's going to be a human rights issue. And when we talk about human rights, of course, human rights are universal, right? But some stories needs to be prioritized over others. And indigenous communities are the most important group, which is right now in a very precarious condition because of climate change. Climate change is already there. We are locked into climate change scenario, right? So what provision we can make? We need to prioritize how we need to kind of like factor their aspiration and expectations. So I see the movement of late is talking about, more representation from indigenous community there, what their aspiration is, how they should talk about their well-being, their rights, and their place in whole climate politics narrative. So for me, it still has not achieved much. I'm not going to talk about the problems, like any problem, ABC, whether you talk about like food security, whether you talk about like access to natural ecosystem services, you talk about, like disaster, climatic impact, indigenous population anywhere in the world, like faces the brunt of it. In South Asia specifically, we don't have one particular level of indigenous community. We South Asia still need to kind of like contextualize and appropriate the term indigenous in its own way. We are so diverse. Consider in Nepal, you have so many diverse indigenous group. In India, you have like so many diverse indigenous group, and they need to come together. They need to share the common understanding, like what are our common denominator that we need to present in quest of climate change and climate justice. So we need to kind of like also, the movement also need to kind of like build solidarity. But it's very important that indigenous communities, the leadership should show up at regional, national and international spaces and demand the space which is rightfully theirs. Be it conversation around finance movement, be it conversation around technology acceptance and deployment, be it around governance and leadership in terms of like planning the adaptation and resilience and resource recovery better. So indigenous community need to have not only one seat at the table, at least 40 to 50% seat at the table, because if indigenous community and the marginalized communities are protected and their aspirations and their rights are being safeguarded, everyone else will be protected. So I do feel that we need to come out of that frame. We need to kind of like specifically climate change is not a business opportunity, it's a human rights challenge, and government needs to play a central part to kind of like protect and bring forward the indigenous angle, the lens. Yeah.
Thanks, Ritz, bringing this issue.
Yeah.
Recently, I'm really surprised that there is a network, I don't know, maybe I can name that one or not,
Yeah.
a network of climate change action network, a kind, climate action South Asia network, a kind, network of more than 300 civil society or something.
Right.
They are working, South Asia, across the South Asia, and they had recently a meeting in Kathmandu. And as you said, that this vulnerable group, the indigenous peoples, the gender, and the other minority groups should be at the forefront in the decision-making level, in the discussions. But not only that one, recently I also attended some of the UN meetings. Only the states, obviously this system is different. So there are some INGOs who are working, this climate change has been a fancy word for, gaining attractions and everything. But then these communities are actually put aside. They are not given an opportunity to take part in many decision discussions, finance, and so forth.
Right.
How do you observe, as you yourself have been participating in many, INGOs, conferences, and discussion, and so forth? Do you see these minority groups or indigenous groups and other, the LGBTQI plus communities and at the table in this discussion?
It's interesting, Dave, that you asked me this question, and I'm pondering, I'm kind of like struggling to find an answer. I do see like these INGOs and the Action Network, they're talking about these issues like indigenous issues or, like the LGBT queerness issues or other marginalized group. They will bring this community just to talk about the problem, right? Like what is your suffering looks like. Talk about your suffering and you just blah, 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 you go, right? You disappear. And most importantly, like how these INGOs are kind of like being challenged right now is that they need to talk about this issue because we are indigenous group and other marginalized group are getting educated. We are learning the world view. We are getting connected with digital, and digital revolution that we are witnessing, and AI is gonna come. So it's gonna, like make more indigenous and other marginalized group representation more forceful. Now, what I see is like, these groups, like the INGOs, the Action Network, you name any, right? They've been formed around early 2000, when the climate change issue was like more scientific, technical, and policy and business. And all of a sudden, climate change is so sort of like, it is being whitewashed, greenwashed. And, you're talking about, solarization, you're talking about just transition, just forgetting about that just transition should be norm respecting with equity and having a justice angle to it. So and most of these INGOs and Action Network, they don't have indigenous and marginalized group in their staff, in their board. So even if they do have that's just like tokenistic representation. So, they have, I'm sorry to say, this privilege is going on inside of these bubbles. whether you're talking about INGOs, like I'm talking about INGOs and all, they are living in these bubbles, and they have this privilege. So something which is not a problem to you personally will not acknowledge that. That is what your privilege is. So if I am facing something that is my personal problem, indigenous community's problem, or marginalized community's problem, that is a problem personally because of climate change and other systemic and social barrier which is getting magnified, then they will never understand. So it's important that this INGOs, their networks, their movements need to being questioned, and more spaces, more accommodation from the marginalized indigenous group needs to be created. I agree with you. I don't see the tokenism will work anymore. They need to kind of speak hard truth. It's better for everyone. It will give us solution, but it may not at right away, right? Ready solution, but it will sort of guide us, where to look at, where are our pressing points, and how we can, cultivate a route that is, inclusive and, sustaining for everyone. Yeah, that's
another thing. I think being a researcher and then a researcher, human rights activist, and then this global south, you are many times you are taking a lead.
Yeah.
Just I want to know your perspective, and many researchers, many writers actually happen to keep the indigenous peoples under the category of minority.
Yeah.
Just basket, minority groups needs to be cared. They have to be prioritized, just like indigenous and so forth and so forth.
Yeah.
I want to know your perspective, or your way. I mean, your perspective, as well as I believe that you can convince to others as well. Do you think will that just give a justice if putting this indigenous and other Dalits and LGBTQI under one basket, minority, or when they do a research, any publications, should they categorize differently? Yes. And give priority?
Yes.
I want to know your perspective and how we should approach in that angle actually.
Yeah, this is something which is being thank you for, you are just I'm feeling I feel that this is something kind of evoking my true researcher, how I feel and see things, and the connection of indigenous and marginalization, right? I feel that indigenous and marginalized community representative, they do have the acumen, they do have the wisdom and knowledge to not only contribute in that minority space, but across the board. You bring indigenous researcher, you bring marginalized researcher to talk about how your finance instruments gonna shape up, right? Why indigenous representation and marginalized representation are not there, when you talk about how the loss and damage financial architecture will look like. Where are they? You can't say that they don't know the stuff. Indigenous and marginalized community do have talented, educated individuals and researchers. They are not getting there. So I think it's very wrong thing which is happening, labeling indigenous, gender intersections, LGBT queerness and caste groups into one minority frame. This is limiting the potential, huge amount of potential which is coming from this community. They are a sun. You cannot really hide them, under the cloud. They will radiate. So I think that's angle need to be changed, and they won't change it. They will keep on putting the indigenous, marginalized, and gender intersection into one group because it's fitting their bill on shaping up the narrative. So I think the groups should be asking spaces that we don't want to fit in there. So if I'm an indigenous researcher, I should be talking about issues around finance, technology, governance across the board, because I do have the education, I do have the worldview, I do understand the politics and technology to not only kind of talk about my community, but world in general. So I think those kind of enabling environment should be there. If it's not being created, then like the indigenous and marginalized group need to sort of like build more co-creation and more collaboration among themselves to kind of like talk about these issues.
Okay, so we covered about the issues of modern slavery.
Yeah.
Well, then we connected with the climate change. As you said, this has been a fancy word.
Yeah.
And later on, also there is also another fancy word called business and human rights.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
In the name of this business activities that
Yeah.
has actually resulted a kind of massive human rights.
Yeah.
When we relate with indigenous peoples, they are the one who are suffering
Yeah.
in the name of hydropower, in the name of mining,
Yeah.
doing a business. And I believe lately you also have started working in these areas
Yeah,
as well. I just request you to talk about a minute or two how this business, so-called business activities are, impacting this, violating human rights, and then what these business activities or corporations should care for.
Yeah, thank you, Dave. This is pretty interesting. Like, I do have a master's in business and human rights from University of Bergen, right? And of late, the intent, the UN intent on the guiding principle on business and human rights, we call it Ruggies principles as well, is good. It's like checking how business should not be having this, unilateral mindset for creating profit, but it should be addressing the social and the human rights cause as well. The intent is good, the guidelines and the framing is good, but of late there's a traction I see. But major corporations, be it transnational corporation, MNCs, and regional companies, when they do business in global South country, they compromise the human rights element, specifically with work conditions, specifically with wages, and long hours, and harsh, hostile environment, and sometimes things get messier than that. So it's kind of like I see that some of the corporations, they just adhere to this business and human rights principle just as a checklist, just they do ABCs and they are done, and their job is done. But we need NGOs and civil society to kind of come and see, because business and society cannot be separated. And business thrives because the labor and it builds on the capital and all, and the indigenous and marginalized communities, they are just acting as bodies for this labor to produce, right? So this whole angle, the whole cycle needs to be evaluated in close quarters. Let's not talk about more tokenistic things, and it's important to understand civil societies. This is a new emerging area. I think it's for everyone to understand and aware what are the key areas that we can locate within how business functions within our society in terms of labor and work condition, and how indigenous and marginalized groups are being exploited under this. Yeah.
So Ritz, we have come almost at the end of the show, and at last I would like to request you to give one line message. We covered so many issues that perhaps you have some message to the viewers. Maybe one line message at last.
Yeah. The message is to viewer is that this is a time when we are having access to technology, and the world is getting flatter, but again there are systemic barriers. It's our choice to kind of look out and identify right source of media information, and where to get more knowledge and understanding. And Indigenous TV is one such platform. It is so diversified. You have a lot of interesting themes and discussions you can bring up to, you can dedicate watching, and bring yourself up to speed and make yourself more meaningfully contributed to the media.
Thank you, Ritz, for joining us today in the Dave's Hammer Show, an Indigenous television program.
Thank you, Dave. Thank you.
With said, we have come at the end of the show. Thank you so much, Ritz, for joining us at Indigenous television. But our conversation continues. If you have any queries or feedbacks regarding the Apes Hammer Show, you can reach us at indigenous.television@gmail.com. Next week, I will come up with a new guest to discuss on new issues. Today, we discussed a lot about the modern slavery, climate change. Little we covered about the business and human rights too. We could discuss a lot for a long time. But then next week, with a new guest, we'll discuss on new issues. By then, have a nice weekend. Namaste.